Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 335, The Soviet Space Program, Part 1. Last time, we covered the Battle of Kursk, the crushing rout of the Nazi war machine that would eventually lead to their total defeat in World War II. Today, we will cover the Soviet space program, which was born out of the ashes of the war. My primary sources for today's episode are the three-part series aptly known as the Soviet Space Program. Start with First Steps, 1941 to 1953, by Eberhard Rodel, The Lunar Mission Years, 1959 to 1976, and N1, the Soviet Moon Rocket, the last two by Eugene Reichel. Before we discuss the Soviet space program, we should mention a few Russians who survived into the Soviet era. The first is Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who published in pioneering papers in the late 1800s and early 1900s on astronautic theory, including calculating the classical rocket equation. And in 1929, he introduced the concept of the multi-stage rocket. Yuri Kondratyuk was a Ukrainian Soviet mathematician who developed the first known lunar orbit rendezvous concept, which calculated the process for humans to land on the moon and return to Earth. The third was Friedrich Zander, a Russian and Soviet pioneer of rocketry and spacecraft. He helped develop the first liquid fuel rocket, known as the GERD-X. Both Tsiolkovsky and Kondratyuk would serve time in prison during the purges of the 1930s. Zander would die at the age of 45 in 1933 of typhoid fever. According to many, the Soviet space program began in 1951, led by Sergei Korolev. My research indicates an earlier starting point, with Rodel citing 1941 as the year of the BL-1 Bolkhobitnov rocket-powered aircraft's production. We could go even further back in time to August 1933 with the launch of the GERD-09 rocket. The GERD project was known as the Group for the Investigation of Reactive Propulsion. It has been estimated that approximately 700 scientists and technicians were involved in GERD. Now, before we proceed with the Soviet space program, we need to discuss Sergei Korolev briefly. He had a troubled childhood as his parents divorced at an early age, but his mother told him that his father had died. This led to quite a lonely life for the boy, but when his mother remarried, Sergei's stepfather became a very positive influence in his life, helping him with his education. In 1913, Sergei attended an air show that changed his life. He would educate himself in aeronautical engineering, first attending the Kiev Polytechnic Institute, then the Bauman Moscow State Technical University in July 1926. The famous aircraft designer Andrei Tupolev, a professor at the university, would serve as one of his mentors. When the Great Purges swept through the Soviet Union, many in the aeronautic field were targeted. Korolev would be arrested by the NKVD on June 27, 1938, and tortured at the Lubyanka prison, forcing his confession to crimes he did not commit. Korolev would be sent to a Gulag forced labor camp in Kolyama in the far east of Siberia, working in a coal mine. Tupolev would intervene and help bring him back to Moscow, but the harsh conditions of the Gulag would cause him to lose most of his teeth to scurvy and have a heart attack. Korolev would be forced to work in a special camp designed for aeronautical design and construction, especially for the war effort. By 1945, he would be drafted into the Red Army, serving as a colonel. In September of that year, Sergei would be sent to the Soviet-occupied section of Germany to study the V-2 rocket, along with numerous other scientists. He would return to the Soviet Union in 1947, along with 2,000 German rocket scientists. The deportations of the German scientists to the Soviet Union were known as Operation Oso Aviokem. Because of security concerns, the Germans were used sporadically. After extracting as much as they could from the Germans, they were sent back to Germany, East Germany, in 1951, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this coming up in this episode, because it was really surprising how they did this. Korolev would continue his work on rocket technology, as Stalin viewed this as a crucial step in keeping the West in check during the Cold War. Sergei's work was instrumental in developing the first intercontinental ballistic missile system, or ICBM. At this point, and this is really interesting, his value was so great that his name was erased from the records to prevent any potential assassination attempts. Throughout his work on the Soviet space program, few knew his name, as he would often go by chief designer or Glavny Konstruktor, even among the astronauts he worked with. Korolev would be instrumental in the construction of the R-7 rocket, Sputnik 1, the launch of Laika the space dog, Sputnik 3, and sending the first human into space, Yuri Gagarin, and the first person, Alexei Leonov, to conduct a spacewalk. Such was the influence of Korolev on the space program. Starting in 1960, he began to suffer from a string of heart attacks, with a massive one eventually killing him in 1966. While Korolev was critical in the creation of the space program, many have criticized him, blaming his lack of education in rocketry for the Soviets' failure to land on the moon ahead of the Americans. That will definitely be a topic for discussion in the next episode. Going back to 1946, the Soviets learned through their spy network that the U.S. had launched a V-2 rocket in the New Mexico desert. In response to this, on April 29, 1946, there was a meeting regarding the Soviet use of rockets as weapons. This led to a meeting of the Council of Ministers of the USSR on May 13, 1946, where they created a 32-point directive aimed at catching up and surpassing the U.S. in rocket technology. The meeting also created a Council of Chief Designers. They would be led by Korolev and include Valentin Glushko, Vladimir Barman, Nikolai Pelyugin, Mikhail Ryazansky, and Viktor Kuznetsov. Because of the spying operation on the U.S. nuclear warhead development, Stalin wanted to make sure that the Soviet Union had the missile capacities to carry its own thermonuclear weapons. One of the earliest rockets to be tested in this development program was the A4 Series T. The first launch was on October 18, 1947. It would fly for 128 miles with a maximum altitude of 53 miles. This and subsequent test launches would begin at the Kapustin Yar missile range. It is located in the southwest of Russia near the Astrakhan Oblast. The name actually translates as cabbage ravine. Now, according to public opinion in Russia, it is considered to be their Roswell, the site where alien technology is believed to have been found and investigated. Over the first month of testing, out of the 11 rockets launched, 5 hit their targets. Although German scientists were involved in the tests, they provided the Soviets with sufficient experience to continue the work independently. They would continue to question the Germans without ever revealing the progress the Soviets were making. The early missile testing included the R-1, R-2, R-5 Pobeda, R-12 Divna, and the R-14 Shushovaya, among others. In addition to the rocket testing going on at Kapustin Yar, about 11 nuclear bombs were tested there. The R rocket series was designed to begin to measure obstacles to successful spaceflight and weapons delivery systems. They needed to determine factors such as upper atmospheric pressures and re-entry temperatures, as well as conduct trials with research animals to assess the feasibility and safety of manned missions in the future. The first, the R1, stood about 15 meters high and had its initial launch on September 17, 1948. It was followed by the R1 or RA-11, which was similar in size but somewhat bulkier, and that was launched in August of 1950. Another one was the R-A1 or the V-1A, and it stood slightly taller than its predecessors. It was scheduled to launch initially on May 24, 1949, but that was delayed by a while. And the last of the R series was the R-1E, and it was substantially different and taller than the first three. We then have a range of different styles and sizes, from the B1A to the B5B. There would be radical upgrades in areas such as the development of a separable nose section, a guidance system, as well as improvements to the alcohol and oxygen tanks, along with enhancements to engine power and efficiency. With the Cold War raging in the background and tensions between the West and the Soviet Union escalating, rocket brigades were established throughout the USSR. The first group was known as the 22nd Special Purpose Brigade, with their first rocket mission on November 30th, 1950. The 23rd Special Purpose Brigade was founded around the area of Stalingrad in December of that year. The historical significance of the development and testing of the A4 and R1 rockets cannot be minimized. From their inception at Peenemünde in Germany to the joint German-Soviet work at the same place, and the sole Soviet activities for the final 7 years of the 16-year program, great strides were made in the relatively new field of long-distance rocketry. The program, now strictly under military control, would help launch the early successes of the Soviet space program. The R-2 missile development program sought to increase the range and accuracy. Using newly created metal alloys, the engineers on the project were able to double the rocket's range, despite it weighing 770 pounds more than its immediate predecessor. A new radio command guidance system was also introduced, which significantly improved its accuracy in reaching its target. The Soviets recognized that their rockets could be vulnerable to Western missiles, so they invested considerable effort in developing what was known as a rocket complex. A complex, as described in the book The Soviet Space Program, First Steps, included, quote, everything associated with transport, like mobile launch rails, the launch preparation system, the launch itself, and the missile. While the R-2 program was ambitious, and the engineers and scientists involved were under tremendous pressure to achieve success, it initially proved to be a miserable failure. All of the initial 12 launches failed. One of the main reasons was the use of aluminum alloy tail sections instead of steel to lessen the weight of the rockets. This, unfortunately, led to an increase in vibrations, which in turn caused the internal gyroscopes to drift away from the intended targets. The reversion to steel solved the problems, as the subsequent 14 launches showed much better results, with 12 of the firings being successful. The program began to show its value from 1952 through 56. Then, in that year, the military tried to create a new chemical weapon, codenamed Gern. It would create a payload filled with a radioactive liquid which would be released at a great height. That one, they didn't carry very far because they just saw it was too dangerous for them to try it in case of an explosion on the launch pad. Well, after Stalin died in 1953, the Soviet Union was somewhat at odds with its communist partner, the People's Republic of China. In order to try to smooth things out, they began sharing some of their rocketry science with China, which delivered R-2 rockets in the late 1950s. Their first launch from the Jiuquan test site occurred on September 1st, 1960. Early on, Soviet scientists and engineers worked on radically different designs for the next generation of rockets, known as the G2 through G5 program. General Dmitry Ustinov, one of the top leaders in the Soviet Red Army, sought a missile capable of delivering a warhead accurately over a range of over 1,800 miles or about 3,000 kilometers. The work began with the Germans in 1949, with the first successful launch delivered in 1962. While conducting my research on today's topic, I found, I mentioned before about the release of the German rocket scientists, which began 1951, stretching to 1952. I found it to be a profoundly puzzling event. Many of them easily made it to West Germany, while some even managed to reach the United States. After interrogating any scientist or engineer who made it to the West, it was determined that the Soviets were on par with the West's development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, just like the American Navajo, Snark, and Atlas programs. Using the knowledge gained by this baffling leak by the Soviets, the Americans determined that by 1956, their adversaries could deliver a weaponized payload to the Pacific Northwest of the U.S., with total coverage of the entire country by 1958. Until 1956, nearly all of the rocket designs and approaches developed by Soviet scientists and engineers were focused on military applications. This would change on June 20th, 1956, when the government, quote, issued a resolution for the production of a satellite with a designation of Object D, with a weight between 2,200 and 3,000 pounds and a scientific payload of 440 to 600 pounds. This spacecraft, the later Sputnik 3, was supposed to be placed into orbit in 1957 or 58. Before we proceed, we must ask, aside from the military reasons for developing missile systems, what motivated the Soviet Union to work so hard to reach space? In July 1955, the United States announced that it would be the first nation to put a satellite into orbit during the International Geophysical Year, which spanned from July 1st, 1957 to December 31st, 1958. This gave Sergei Korolev the ammunition to get additional funding from Nikita Khrushchev. Anything to outdo the Americans in any field was a popular position for the leader of the USSR. While Sputnik 3 was supposed to be the first satellite to be launched into space with the ability to orbit the Earth, this is Object D, it was Sputnik 1. I know the numbers sound a little odd, but this is what actually happens and what they call it now in the literature. It was Sputnik 1 launched on October 4th, 1957, which reached an apogee of 584 miles or 940 kilometers, circling Earth in 96 minutes until it re-entered the Earth's atmosphere on January 4th, 1958, when it disintegrated. It did release the first satellite, and this event shocked the world, as it was thought that the United States was far ahead of the USSR, and it would start what would be known as the space race. Now, it might seem odd that Sputnik 3 would be the first planned launch. What happened was that the RD-107 and RD-108 engines, developed under the guidance of Valentin Glushko, did not have the thrust necessary to carry the payload that Sputnik 3 was scheduled to take into space. That moved what would become the number 2 satellite into the first position and moved what was to be the initial spacecraft back into the third position. When an attempt was made to launch the heavy payload into space, the rocket broke up just 228 seconds after its April 27, 1958 launch. The R-7 rocket, specifically designed for this launch, was never used again. The next try into space was Sputnik 2. Sputnik 2's tale and that of its cargo is one that we shared in one of our old episodes from another podcast, Laika the Space Dog. Laika was not the first animal, or dog for that matter, to be launched in a rocket by the Soviet space program. Two dogs, Dezik and Saigan, reached a height of 101 kilometers, or approximately 63 miles. Surprisingly, they were both recovered alive. As for Laika, a stray dog found on the streets of Moscow, she did not survive the launch into space, nor was she expected to. The technology to re-enter Earth's atmosphere safely had not been developed yet, and the poor dog died of either, and this one we can't get completely right, either hyperthermia, or overheating, or hypothermia, dying of the cold. And this just happened hours into the flight, presumably during the fourth orbit of the planet. Laika's death, though, was not in vain. Her vital signs were carefully monitored, which showed the scientists that a living creature could indeed survive being launched into space. This was a critical finding, as little was known about the effects of spaceflight on living creatures. Her sacrifice allowed the space program to move forward. Before humans could even imagine flying into space, and of course that was the ultimate goal, several issues with the rocket systems had to be addressed. While the Soviet leaders were always eager to share the successes with the rest of the world, they were horribly reluctant to share in the failures, and boy, were there a lot of them. Of the 9 satellite launches attempted between September 1958 and April 1960, only 2 were deemed complete triumphs, with one being a partial success. And if you think that was bad, the following series of rockets performed even worse. Out of the 13 launched, only 2 completed their mission between 1960 and January 1966. This was to be a disheartening series of failures, as the mission assigned to the scientists and the engineers was to send a Soviet citizen to the moon. The problem with this mission was the extremely tight timeline that Khrushchev had given to the team heading the space program. As usual, Khrushchev was more interested in beating the Americans than he was in being a realist. Also, as I mentioned earlier, Sergei Korolev, the head of the program, was not as capable as was needed to be successful. One small fact I found interesting regarding the Soviet space program was that, early on, their goal wasn't necessarily to reach the moon, but rather to be the first to reach Mars. This idea was first proposed by someone we mentioned earlier, the Russian and Soviet rocket scientist Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who, although he had passed away in 1935, still had a significant influence on many in the Soviet space program. There was one unusual mission planned to showcase to the world the greatness of the Soviet space program. It would aim a rocket at the moon with an atomic bomb as the payload, which would explode on impact. The flash would theoretically be detected by all observatories on Earth. However, this, of course, never happened. The rocket scientists were unable to generate enough thrust to even attempt this ambitious project. One of the concerns that Korolev had was what would happen if the rocket exploded unintentionally, or if it should land where the Americans could get a hold of the nuclear device. At this point in late 1959, the focus of the Soviet space program was on developing the capability to circumnavigate the moon. It would lead to failure after failure, as well as tainting the career of Sergei Korolev. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Join me next time as we conclude the series on the Soviet space program and begin our discussion of the first humans to explore space, who were, of course, Soviet citizens. So until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.